Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, occasionally, YouTube recommends some very interesting things to me, and a couple of days ago, I saw this video in my recommendeds from a channel called RobWords, and it was about the origins of languages, which I've always been really fascinated by, kind of the family tree of languages and how they're all tied to each other and how some are just kind of out of nowhere, not tied to anything. And I've mentioned that occasionally. So I watched a couple of the videos from RobWords, and I thought, there's probably some things here I could do on the channel. And so I decided to find one that I hadn't watched yet that I think would be interesting and be a cool lens through which to view parts of history. And this one's called The Origin of Every English City's Name. Now, if you are someone like me who lives in Ohio, you know the origin of all your cities' names. Basically, we just stole all Europe's names. We literally have a city for pretty much a name for pretty much every European city of any European city that you've ever heard of. We've got one in Ohio. We've got Moscow and London, and we've got Berlin, and we've got pretty much all the other ones, even some really minor ones. We've got Lima for Lima, Peru, and we've got Madrid, and we've got Macedonia. I mean, we've even named some of our cities after countries. But if you go to older places like England, you're going to find that their city names have very interesting origins, especially depending on who settled that part of England, because England, like a lot of places, is somewhere that's been settled by a lot of different groups of people over the years. So I thought this would be an interesting one to look at. I'll put the link down in the description, so if you want to check out RobWords' channel without my commentary, that'll be a gateway for you to do that. Let's dive into this one.
Right, the origin of every English city's name. There are 55 of them. It's quite a lot. So let's get cracking. Welcome to another RobWords.
Okay, so he's actually going to go to the actual cities. So in a lot of places like here in the States, we use terms like town and city kind of interchangeably. And depending on what state you're in, there are specific legal definitions. So for example, where I live, we have villages, and villages will often have mayors. But I spent most of my adult life in Austintown, which is a town of like 30,000 people, but it doesn't have a mayor. It's not really a city, legally speaking. It's a township, and so it has township trustees. Whereas you could go a few miles away to a place like McDonald, which is this village of like 3,000 people, and they do have a mayor. Even though they're much smaller, they function more like a city. So there are legal things, but in England, I know there are specific legal terms for things like cities, and so you're either actually a city or you're not.
First, some quick context. England's place names are a product of England's history.
Yeah.
They've been influenced by, in order, the Celtic Britons who were around from the Iron Age, the Romans who spent a few centuries there, the Anglo-Saxons who came after them, the Vikings who took control of a massive chunk of England, and then William the Conqueror's Normans. Throw in some Christianity and a millennium of lazy pronunciation and mishearings, and you get to the place names we have today.
So it's funny he mentions the lazy pronunciation, because in talking to my friends who live in the UK, that's something they point out all the time, is that, listen, if you want to learn how to pronounce our place names, just go for the easiest pronunciation possible, the one that involves taking out letters and shortens it and makes it like simple. So instead of saying Leicester, you're just saying Leicester, because it's quicker, that's the kind of thing.
Now, we're just going to look at the cities because we'd be here all day otherwise. Contrary to popular belief, there are no specific criteria for a place in England to be designated a city.
Really?
It is just that at some point, the monarch has to have decided that it is.
Yeah, and so this just happened recently. I think, was it Wrexham that just became a city?
It is.
Or is this just England?
At some point,
I think he's just doing England.
The monarch has to have decided that it is.
Yeah, so like in Wales, Wrexham just was given city status. City or town, I think it was city.
None of this, it has to have a cathedral or a university nonsense. That's why they're of all shapes and sizes. So with which city do we start? Well, how about the city of London? Because not only is London our nation's capital, but it is also potentially one of the oldest and most mysterious place names that we have. The earliest known name for London is what the Romans called it, Londinium, but we have no idea what that means or where it came from. Romans liked to adapt the existing names of places rather than come up with new ones, but historians haven't been able to make any Celtic words fit. Could it be from this, meaning marsh with a fort? Nope, there's no evidence of a fort. Could it be from this, meaning fast-flowing river? Maybe, but it's a bit of a leap, isn't it? So historians think the name could come from even before the Celts, from a language we know nothing about. Wow. That's great,
cool.
But now I have to give you one that we can explain, don't I? So let's go with the presidential sounding Lincoln, a city whose cathedral was once the tallest structure in the entire world.
It was for a good long time the tallest structure in the entire world.
Its name is a Celtic-Roman hybrid. The Celts named it Lindon, no relation to London, using their word for pool, and the Romans called it Lindum Colonia after they built a colonia there, a kind of retirement village for soldiers. Through a few centuries of laziness and mumbling, you get from that to Lincoln.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that is the ultimate in laziness. I love it.
One of the theories behind how Colchester got its name is from one of those Roman colonia stuffed with ex-legionaries. It looks like it's named after the river Colne, which in turn might be named after a colonia, although some historians reckon that Colne is actually Celtic because it pops up in other names in other parts.
The point I think that we can make already is that there's so much we just still don't know, even down to the origin of city names. I think that's fascinating. That just goes to show you that even when we go back through thousands of years of history, there's still so much to be learned. And it may be that at some point something gets uncovered, some document, some piece of rock, some previously unknown item that opens up a world to us that we didn't have before on some of this stuff.
Of the country. Now, the Chester in Colchester is the bit we really need to talk about because the story behind it is surprisingly surprising. At first glance, it seems simple. The Romans built a fort there, and their word for fortification was castrum. So, they slammed that on the end of the name. Easy. But nope. Yes, the Chester comes from the Latin for fort, but the Romans did not put it there. It was the Anglo-Saxons who put the Chester in Colchester to say, hey, that's where the Romans were. And the same goes for every Chester, Castor, and Cester in the country.
Like Leicester.
So let's tick off some more cities. You've got Chichester, which is probably named after an Anglo-Saxon called Cissa. Winchester, with the win, thought to come from a Celtic word for a meeting place, pronounced Wenter by the Romans.
Right, so Winchester was kind of the ancient capital of Wessex, and that's where the council would meet to determine leadership, and so that one makes a lot of sense.
Manchester is potentially named after a breast-shaped hill, meaning it's related to the words mammal and mama rather than
Boob City. I love it. That's fantastic.
Man. The Romans called it Mancunium, hence the locals are still called Mancunians. And then there's Chester, which is frankly just cheating. It was a Roman fort like the rest of them, but has resisted attempts to differentiate it with something extra at the start. The names Lega Chester, Legion Chester, and West Chester failed to stick. Etymologically identical to the Chesters are the Casters. Lancaster was the fort by the river Lune, in turn thought to come from a word meaning healthy or pure. Doncaster is at the river Don. Don is just a Celtic word for river, so it's literally the river, as are the various river Avons, also Celtic, and river Ouzes. Exeter is another caster on a river, which used to be this mouthful before it passed through the laziness filter.
It's like we ain't saying all that.
It's named after the river Exe, which again probably just means river, specifically a river replete with fish. More on rivers to come, and also bridges, because there is a lot of crossover, pun intended. But first, the final Roman forts, the cesters, not a single one of which is pronounced like it's spelt.
Nope.
We do it to confuse tourists. Cirencester stays true to its roots, but it is not a city, so we're not interested. But we are interested in Leicester. It's named after a Celtic tribe, and to the Anglo-Saxons was Ligere Ceastre. You can actually see a version of that on this super old map. But
I've been to Leicester. It's a nice little city. Of course, a lot of history related to the Wars of the Roses, Richard III. That's where he's buried. You can actually visit the museum that is built around the spot where they found his body several years ago under a parking lot, or a car park as they call it there. But the cathedral is really cool there, and then you don't go far outside the city to go to places like the Bosworth battlefield. So it's a neat little place to visit.
Bit by bit, we shed those tiresome syllables, in pronunciation anyway. Speech didn't match spelling because, most people couldn't read. To the west, saucy little Worcester is named after the weird...
And see, here in Ohio, we just get lazy with some of those ourselves. And so instead of spelling it that way, we actually have Wooster, Worcester.
Gora tribe. And the southern city of Gloucester was the fort at Glaive, thought to maybe come from a Celtic word for glow. So with all those cesters, casters and chesters, the Anglo-Saxons gave a nod to the Romans who'd come before them. But almost everywhere...
And, there's a history of that in other cultures, too. Here in the United States, a lot of our city names are named after the tribes of Native Americans who were there before them. Even our state, Ohio, is an Indian word, a Native American word, an indigenous people's word, whatever way you choose to describe them. But growing up, obviously, we were taught it was an Indian word. That was just how it was described. Pennsylvania's got a ton of those.
Else they named or renamed using their own language, Old English, and they are responsible for the vast majority of the place names that we have today. Among them, Norwich, which is the North Wich, which being an Anglo-Saxon word for a settlement or village. It gives us the Wick place names too. The northernness of Norwich is likely in comparison to their fellow East Anglians down in Ipswich, which isn't a city, and I bet they're a bit annoyed about it.
Yeah, they got a team in the Premier League now, but they're not a city. I was actually just a couple miles away from both of those cities when I was just in England about a month ago. Seeing some videos from there soon. We did a tour around some of the bases in East Anglia.
East Anglia is, of course, so called because the Angles were there. Another Anglo-Saxon pairing are Northampton and Southampton, but this time it is the southern settlement that is actually a city. Southampton was originally actually another witch, but it changed from Hamwich to Hamtun. In this case, the ham bit comes from the Old English for an enclosure, probably the same root as when we say something is hemmed in fact.
Okay.
We'll talk about a different Anglo-Saxon ham a bit later. But anyway, the tun, or tun, refers to a farmstead or village. Eventually it becomes our town. Up in West Yorkshire, Wakefield shows off another Anglo-Saxon suffix. Field meant, we'll have a guess. Yes, field.
And what's cool is you can use a lot of these same concepts then to figure out the origin of what we call surnames or last names. For example, I wrote a book a few years ago about the Whitaker family, and that came from a northern term. The Whitakers originally from up around Yorkshire, Yorkshire and Manchester, where it was Yorkshire and Lancashire, I guess it would be, because Manchester's a city within that. It was White Acre. It was from the place. And so a lot of the same thing. The names, at least English names, generally come from either who you're the son of, so in other words, your parentage, or they come from a place, or they come from an occupation, like Smith, for example.
And a wake was a kind of medieval village festival. So despite sounding somewhat funereal, Wakefield is actually a fun, festive name related
that's cool.
to fairs. Another city with an Anglo-Saxon name is Stoke-on-Trent. The River Trent is just referenced to differentiate it from various other Stokes. Stoke, coming from the Old...
And you see a lot of that, something on something. And Weston-on-Trent, same thing. That's where some of my family comes from, Weston-on-Trent.
English for outlying farm or settlement. The same word also gives us the place names ending with stock. Now, I said we'd cross this bridge when we got to it, and that is the Bridge, because Cambridge is so called because there was a river crossing there. It was originally called Granter Bridge because it was on the River Granter. However, it appears that the Normans struggled to pronounce that with their fancy French mouths, so it morphed into Cambridge or Cambridge, and then, rather ridiculously, the name of the river was changed to fit. So the river running through Cambridge is now called the Cam, although at some other points it is still the Granter. Cambridge's university rivals in Oxford can also pin their place name on a passing river. Ford is a really common Anglo-Saxon suffix, meaning, well, ford. It's a place where you can get across a river, often because it's shallow enough. Oxford is where you could easily lead oxen over the river. Near the Welsh border, Hereford means place where an army can cross, this time over the River Wye. Then a cross in Essex, so called because it was the Eastern Kingdom of the Saxons. You find
same thing with Wessex was the Western Kingdom, Sussex the South Kingdom, Middlesex, which is around where London is. There is no Norsex.
Chelmsford. It's thought to be named after a fella called Cholmer or Colmer, who also gave his name to the River Chelmer, which you can ford there. And then back up in Yorkshire, Bradford simply means broad ford. There's one more ford city left, and that is Salford. The sol, or sal, bit comes from the sallow trees, which were in abundance there. They are a type of willow, and also immortalised in the names Sale, Sellafield, and Selborne, among others. Salford ain't the only city to be named after a tree. The tree at the end of Coventry means just that. Tree.
Really?
It's reckoned that the rest of the name comes from whoever owned that tree. One theory is that it was a Saxon called Coffer.
So this town got a name because some dude owned a tree. That is fantastic. I love that.
And another tree appears to have taken root in the name of Lichfield. In fact, not just one, but many. The old Celtic name meant grey wood. The Saxons added the field to make it field of the grey wood or grey trees. Another notable field is Sheffield, the field next to the river Sheaf. Sheaf itself means to divide or separate. For example, to be ashiaf in Old English was to be expelled. The river acted as a boundary between territories.
Wow.
Yorkshire's rivers feature heavily in its place names, actually. We already heard about Doncaster's Don, into which the Sheaf runs, incidentally. But also the name of Leeds flows from the River Aire, albeit indirectly. Its Celtic name, Landensis, meant people of the fast-flowing river. By the time the Anglo-Saxon monk, the Venerable Bede, was taking notes...
Who is responsible for so much of what we know about that time period, the Venerable Bede. I mean, honestly, without... there's a lot of things we can criticize Christians and the church for in this time period, especially as it relates to their treatment of people who weren't Christians. Rather violent at times. And they weren't the only religion who did that, but I, as a Christian, am criticizing my fellow Christians for that. But so much of education and literacy and history and the encouragement of science that we had at that time came from the church.
It had become Lloydis. And Kingston upon Hull, commonly known as just Hull, is named after the river there, which is called the Hull.
I'm surprised they don't just call it Kingston. I mean, I know Hull, they call it. I've heard people refer to it.
Hull, either from the Celtic for muddy, which it flippin' is, or the Old Norse for deep, which it presumably also is. Old Norse is the language of the Vikings.
Deep and
by
muddy.
the way, plenty more on them to come.
Yeah.
The Kingston bit of Kingston upon Hull literally means King's Place or King's Estate. The king in question is Edward I, who, according to legend, was chasing a hare in the area one day and fell in love with it. The area, not the hare. So he had it for his own.
He actually died up there. If you've ever seen the movie, I mean, it's not all 100% accurate, but Outlaw King, which is fantastic and way more accurate in terms of its portrayal of Robert the Bruce and the Scottish Wars of Independence than Braveheart is. And Chris Pine does a pretty good Scottish accent. It's a great movie. Really, really enjoy that movie a lot. Just watched it again the other day. You see a much more accurate portrayal of Edward I, played by Stephen Delane. And he was marching north to deal with the Scots again when he died.
Area, not the hare. And the tiny, tiny North Yorkshire city of Ripon perhaps also gets its name from the nearby waters. Its earliest recorded name is Inhrippum, but no one knows precisely what that meant. One theory is that it means at the river bank, and that's backed up by its location near where two rivers meet. But I'm actually more convinced by the theory that it's named after the Hripper, who were an Anglian tribe. Now, arguably England's worst watery place name belongs to the similarly small city of Ely, which means Eel Island. Yes, Ely is thought to get its name from the fact it's a bit Ely.
So I'm curious, any of you watching, do you live in any of these places? Let me know in the comment section. if one of these cities that we're talking about is where you live or where you grew up.
And on the south coast, Portsmouth is so called because it had a port at the mouth of a river.
Which is funny because we have a Portsmouth in Ohio. In fact, my great-grandparents were married there and had their first kids there before they came up north to northeast Ohio. And I guess technically it's a port's mouth because it's the Ohio River is there, and then the Scioto River flows into the Ohio there. But it's not a port like on an ocean.
A famous old document called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims that Portersmouth was actually named after a Saxon called Port, which is a slightly less boring explanation, I suppose. And the equally mouthy Plymouth sits at the mouth of the River Plym. Plym perhaps simply comes from the Anglo-Saxon for plum, so I suppose I could have mentioned this one in the tree section too.
So you notice how many of these obviously have their names transported to the United States. Plymouth Colony was so named because there was a company that sponsored all of, that was connected to the settlement of the New World, and so that was where they got the name. And to this day, their team, which I think is in the championship now, which is the second tier of English football, they're called the Pilgrims.
Another watery one, perhaps the wettest of them all, is of course the city of Bath, which is named after the Roman baths that were there. The Romans called it Aquae Sulis, meaning waters of Sulis. Apparently Sulis was a local goddess of water and healing. The Anglo-Saxons simplified things by just calling it Bathan, or Baths. The nearby city of Wells has a similarly literal liquid-related name. Its Old English name was Wella, and it refers to the 3 wells dedicated to St Andrew there. Now, while we're in the vicinity, we should bring up Bristol, whose name is somewhat water adjacent. Quite literally, it's thought to mean assembly place at the bridge. At one point, it was just Bridgestow. However, the theory is that the name changed because of a quirk of the local accent. Supposedly, folk in the area had a habit of pronouncing W's as L's, a bit like some people now say gill instead of girl, or bottle instead of bottle. Now, Bridgestow really did have a W at the end, but it's thought that fancy folk, keen not to seem ignorant, may have overcorrected that W into a L, even though it was...
So what makes me think of something really cool, if you've ever seen the series The Last Kingdom, which, again, fantastic if you want to look at the kind of the Anglo-Saxon period of English history, when the Vikings were coming over and all of that was going on. A lot of times when they are going to a particular place, like Winchester, for example, they'll show the Anglo-Saxon name, and then it'll unscramble to what the modern name is. Or like Ephewich, as they called it, which was the Roman Eboracum, which was the Viking Jorvik, which is now York. So it's had all these different names, and so they refer to it as Ephewich there, and then they kind of show that. So it's neat seeing the different names depending on who was talking about it.
It was never meant to be a L in the first place. Thus, with a bit of laziness thrown in around the middle, you get from Bridgestow to Bristol. One last wet one is way up in Liverpool, which is actually a comparatively new name. It was first recorded in the 12th century, so after the Norman conquest. The pool bit is thought to refer to a muddy tidal creek that perhaps no longer exists there. And the liver? Well, maybe it was shaped a bit like a liver? Sorry, I don't know actually. I couldn't find a good explanation for that one. Yeah. Now, before we get on to the Viking and Norman nomenclature, we need to sweep up some more Anglo-Saxon stuff, because there's a really common place name suffix or group of suffixes that we haven't talked about yet. You see, when the Angles and Saxons felt one of their territories was under threat, usually from the Vikings I just mentioned, they would build their own little fortifications. Fortifications that they called burhs.
Yep.
And the locations of these forts are preserved in the place names ending burh, borough, bruh, and berry. The city of Canterbury was the burh of the Cantii, what the Romans called the people of Kent, although the twist in the Canterbury tale is that it was the Jutes who built the fortification there, not the Angles nor the Saxons, although the term Anglo-Saxon actually refers to all three groups.
Right, I was going to say the Jutes were part of the Anglo-Saxons. They were three separate groups that were all coming at the same time. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes.
And more, in fact. Salisbury played host to another Anglo-Saxon burh.
That's the English version of Salzburg in Austria.
Salis bit, though, which we pronounce so apathetically now, is something of a mystery. It's thought to potentially have the same root as the Sarum in the name of the astonishing nearby historical site of Old Sarum. Indeed, at one point, Salisbury was called New Sarum. But where that Sarum comes from, nobody knows. Another city
I had always been told that Salisbury and Salzburg were the same name with just a slightly different language.
Thoroughly Burly is Peterborough. In fact, the locals for a time just called it Borough, but eventually realised that that wasn't specific enough. So they extended it to Peterborough in honour of the monastery around which the protective walls had been built. A monastery dedicated to none other than St. Peter. Once the Anglo-Saxons left behind their colourful pantheon of pagan gods and converted to Christianity, they took to their new faith with gusto, and the Peter in Peterborough is just one holy hint at that. Another one is in the name of St. Albans. It's named after the very first British saint, St. Alban, who was martyred there in what the Romans had named Verulamium. He was executed in the 3rd or 4th century for becoming a Christian.
And there are a couple of Wars of the Roses battles fought there, right outside of London.
Conversion that the Romans would not that long after rather hypocritically make themselves. The city of Westminster also has obvious ecclesiastical links. The minster in question is the abbey that remains there today. The west part may well have been to contrast it with St. Paul's to the east. But hiding its holy history.
And Westminster Abbey is actually the Church of St. Peter. And my understanding is that the idea, the term that we use, robbing Peter to pay Paul, actually comes from money being diverted from St. Peter's, from Westminster Abbey, to St. Paul's.
History just a little bit better is the Lancashire city of Preston. You'll recognise the ton bit, the Anglo-Saxon settlement suffix, but Preston is specifically thought to be the settlement of the priest, or priests. An abbey was set up there by St. Wilfrid. Right, we're making some good progress, aren't we? Let's keep going. The priests of Preston were not the only people to get a place named after them. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons made a bit of a habit of it. Birmingham is named after a fella called Bjorme. That's where the Birm bit comes from. The ing bit is an Anglo-Saxon element meaning the people of, and the ham, also from Old English, an ancestor of our word home, means homestead. So Birmingham means homestead of the people of Bjorme. It was the home of Bjorme's tribe, the Bjormingas.
That's awesome. So what's fascinating about this is we've gotten through 43 and we haven't gotten to the Viking words yet, which kind of shows you that the places where the Vikings settled didn't tend to develop into cities or don't have that deep history that many of the east and south areas do. And right outside of Birmingham, I actually learned something when I was there. Wednesbury, which is one of the places where my family comes from, actually is a Viking word. It has to do with, again, Bury being from Berg, but in this case, Woden, so the Norse god. It's his home.
Also in the West Midlands, Wolverhampton has nothing to do with wolves. It's thought to be named after a lady called Wulfrun, who was granted the land by Ethelred the Unready. If so, that makes it the only English city named after a woman.
Well, and there's your problem right there, Wolves fans. No, I'm just kidding. I just had to make a crack at Wolverhampton because I'm a West Brom fan.
There is a theory that Ely is named after the famously female St. Athelthryth rather than Eels. Let's hope it is.
Let's hope so.
Anyway, Wulfrun's new land included a place called Llantorn, meaning something like high farm. Her name, plus that, gave Wulfrune Llantorn, which in the 1,000 years since has just become Wolverhampton. Back down on the south coast, the city of Brighton and Hove needs to be taken in two parts.
There's the other Albion.
The Brighton bit was originally Bjorthelm's Toon, or Bjorthelm's Farm. Bjorthelm is thought to have been a person, perhaps named for his bright helmet. The much longer name, Brighthelmstone, was actually in use until as recently as the 19th century. The Hove bit of Brighton and Hove is, I'm afraid, yet another mysterious one. It's perhaps from the Old English hofer, meaning courtyard. The German Hof means the same thing now.
So that's why I would just say Brighton. Forget all that Hove crap.
Okay, hold on to your feathered hats, because we're off to Nottingham next, where I suspect the tales of Robin Hood would have been somewhat less romantic had they gone with the city's original name. Nottingham has not always been Nottingham. It used to be Snottingham. That's right, it was named after a fellow called Snot, and specifically means homestead of the followers of Snot.
My paternal line comes from Nottingham, comes from Edwin Stowe, which is right outside of Nottingham. It's in Nottinghamshire. I hate that. I hate that so much.
There's that ing again. These are Snot's people. It is a city of Snot. Snotty, snotty, Nottingham.
Nice
Perhaps
castle,
it's the
though.
association with nasal discharge, though, that meant Snottingham lost its S. More likely, the Normans just struggled with that sn sound. And lucky for the city that they did. Okay, it's Viking time, because while we're in Nottingham, we're in one of the so-called 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the massive chunk of England that the Norse invaders seized from the Anglo-Saxons. To this day, you can see where the Vikings were just by looking at the names of the places. Close to Nottingham is the city of Derby, another of the 5 boroughs, and more prestigiously, my hometown, which we used to
he's
spell
a West Midland boy. Very cool. Or is that East Midlands? It's the Midlands. Derbyshire, and also Derby, D-E-R-B-Y, that's how they pronounce this. Derby is the term they use for like a local rivalry game in football.
in a way that actually fits with how British people say it. The B in Derby is a classic Scandinavian suffix. It's fairly generic. It means anything from farm to settlement to village. So let's just say place. And in Derby's case, it means place of the deer. It replaced the Anglo-Saxon Northworthy, which I rather like. But anyway, other Viking B places include Whitby, Grimsby and Selby. However, Derby's the only one to have achieved city status so far. As important as Derby and Nottingham were to the Danes, they were nothing compared to their beloved capital of York. The development of the name
Jorvik, Eboracum,
is satisfyingly organic. The Celts called it something along the lines of Eborus, which the Romans adapted into their name, Eboracum. Both meant place of the yew tree. However, when the Anglo-Saxons came to adapt that, they got their translation a little bit wrong and called it Jorforvich, place of the wild boar. The Vikings then put their spin on that and called the place Jorvik, but after they left, the locals struggled with that V. To the people who remained, a V was the same as a U, so they likely pronounced it along the lines of Jorvik. And from there, you basically are already at...
Just get lazy and call it York.
Now, further north, Durham wasn't actually in the Danelaw, but it appears to have been close enough for Old Norse to have influenced the name. It used to be called Dunelm or Dunholm, a hybrid name combining the Anglo-Saxon for hill, dun, and the Scandinavian word holm, meaning island or sticky out bit of land. It reflects the fact that it's on a hill almost completely surrounded by the River Wear. Over the centuries, the Ham became anglicised and the name morphed into Durham. While we're on the Wear, let's follow it up to Sunderland, a city with an unusual story to tell. So you know how if we say something is ripped asunder, we're saying that it has been detached from something else. Well, that idea gives Sunderland its name too. It is land that has been in some way sundered from somewhere else. The leading theory is that it refers to the fact the land was granted to a group of monks living on the opposite side of the river.
If you want to, if you're into sports and you like seeing kind of the behind the scenes of how a team operates, on Netflix, the series Sunderland Till I Die, fantastic.
Hence, the Weir sundered it from them. I really like that one. Now let's take the short trip to Newcastle, where the name requires rather less explaining. It means New Castle. It's finally time for the promised Norman nomenclature, the Norman.
So Newcastle, we have one of those in western Pennsylvania, and it's actually two separate words. It's New Castle.
Because William the Conqueror's lot bloody loved a castle. They couldn't get enough of them. Did you know that there was not a single castle in England before the Normans turned up?
So yeah, I mean, they had kind of forts, but not a traditional stone castle. And yeah, this is part of... we've talked about this when we talk about William the Conqueror. He didn't just come in and take the crown. He completely transformed the nation, as we understand a nation. Obviously, it's very different then. put people in charge, his own people, his own Normans in charge, made them earls everywhere. Destroyed a lot, especially in the north, built castles everywhere to be able to control the land, did a census and kind of an accounting of everything that he now owned. He really transformed the country.
But after they arrived, they put them anywhere and everywhere that they felt a little bit unsafe. The castle in Newcastle was probably new in comparison with the castles the Normans had already built in Durham, York and Richmond to protect against Scottish invaders. The Normans actually didn't generally meddle all that much with England's place names, but on a few occasions they added to them to show off that they were now in charge. For example, the town of Ashby de la Zouch was just called Ashby until the Zouch family took control, and Leighton Buzzard was so called by the Boussard family. But there's only one current city that the Normans renamed in that way, and it is Milton Keynes. Now, there's a bit of a joke, although I think some people think that it's the truth, that the place is named after a pair of Johns, the poet John Milton and the economist John Maynard Keynes.
And isn't that the city that has like an ungodly number of roundabouts that people complain about?
But that is not the case. The Milton bit is a simple bit of Anglo-Saxon. It is a shortening of Middleton, meaning middle village. All Suttons mean southern village, and all Nortons mean northern village.
So I wonder, is it because it's kind of partway in, but it's kind of in the middle between London and Birmingham, which are the two largest cities in England?
Anyway, the Keynes bit comes from the Cahane family, who came over with our friend Willie the Sea. Wow, just 3 more cities to sweep up, the ones I didn't know where else to put. Okay, first, Southend-on-Sea, whose simplicity is surely its strength. The original settlement was at the south end of a village called Brittlewell, and it sits on the sea. At the other extreme of England is Carlisle, whose name is perhaps a Roman-Celtic hybrid. It's thought to mean Fort of Lug, who was a Celtic god of skills. The Romans called it Luguvalium. But after the Romans left, the locals translated it back into their local, sadly extinct, form of Celtic, Cumbric, in which it was Caerluel and thence Carlisle. Our final city name comes from another Celtic stronghold way down in Cornwall. It is the tricky to decipher Truro.
I'm not even familiar with this one.
This name might come from the Cornish, another Celtic language, Triveru, meaning 3 rivers, but maybe
which is where you get the Trevi Fountain in Rome, is from 3 rivers. Or 3 roads.
From another lost term, meaning place of turbulent waters. We don't know. The mystery remains. The Celtic languages have so much more to offer in terms of place names. That is why I have limited this video to just England. Wales and Scotland have their own stories to tell. But if you have enjoyed this video, I posted some extra stuff about English place names on my Patreon here, and I think you'd enjoy this video.
So I really enjoyed that. I love that kind of stuff, learning about where names came from and the language origins, and he does a fantastic job of presenting it. So check out his channel, subscribe I'm subscribed to him now. If you see a video on there that you think it would be interesting and you'd like to hear my take on it and what I'd like to add to it, let me know in the comment section below. And as I said, if you're from one of those 55 cities in England we just talked about, let us know where you're watching from. Thanks for watching.